Hello.
Yes, welcome everybody. We're starting our weekly live stream and podcast a little later than we were hoping to, but we've really dialed in some interesting technology here, and so grateful to Salton Studios to be able to help us spread this message and vision and solution that is permaculture. This is another episode of the Permanent Culture Podcast and Livestream, and I'm really excited to announce that Rikki, Longino, our vice chair for the Utah Permaculture Collective, we're going to start co-hosting this series a lot more often. So welcome, Rikki, and awesome. I'm so glad to be doing this with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited because today we have with us one of my permaculture teachers from back in 2011. I took my permaculture design certification when I was 17 years old, and this person was really influential in teaching me about the principles and practices of permaculture. And we had some technical difficulties today, perhaps because of all the other live streaming that's happening right now, but really excited to welcome Tao Orion.
So thank you for being on the show today, Tao, and joining our podcast and live stream. I think a good place to start, as always, would be to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from, and we'll take the conversation from there.
Great. Yeah, thanks. It's so good to be here and such interesting times and sharing some important conversations with you. My name is Tao Orion, as you mentioned, and I am residing on the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people in the southern Willamette Valley of Oregon. And I have a small 6.5 acre organic farm that I live on with my husband and 2 unschooled wily children. And I am an author, so I wrote the book Beyond the War on Invasive Species. And I'm also working on a couple other book projects, as well as just keeping up with all of the life on the farm, and also have a consulting business, Resilience Permaculture Design, where I work mostly with larger scale land stewardship operations and landowners, looking at sustainable forestry, water management, agroforestry, and holistic restoration. So keep pretty busy with all of those different things. And I'm just really feeling so much more lately the importance of this kind of earth-based knowledge and community building skills, and that permaculture has brought into my life. So I'm excited to chat more about that.
There's definitely a gift to having the solace and purpose of a garden in your life. And 6.5 acres is quite the garden, right? We're talking a farm there for you. But I can't imagine during this pandemic and all of the uncertainty that's going on and all the opportunity that's going on, not having gardening and permaculture and that lens to see through. You mentioned kind of you're even reliving just how important that is to you. What has been your experience since all of this has been going on, and how has it maybe changed or impacted your relationship and feelings about permaculture and being connected to your land?
Well, we definitely scaled up our production of just home-based food stuff from what we were planning on doing this year. And we're also scaling up production for food that we can give away to a local nonprofit that does food distribution for people in need. So, in a way, just the timing of when the pandemic kind of started coincided with the northern hemisphere going into the growing season. So we were able to plan and plant up a lot of ground here. and just being able to be more home focused, which we usually are anyways, has definitely brought some new projects and energy into the land, which has been fun. It's always kind of a balance with these home-based endeavors where we haven't really focused on earning a big income from the land. We mostly do it just for our own consumption and fun, because we love just planting a bunch of plants and taking care of them and having animals and things like that. But then we also have to balance that with earning money and being out in the world. So we've kind of transitioned back to more land-based and less being out in the world activities in light of recent events. And that's been nice. It's been, I feel very grateful and privileged to have been able to have this space available, especially with kids, just to have a space for them to be able to run around outside and interact with living things is just incredibly valuable when, we weren't able to see as many people as we usually do. So
Beautiful.
Yeah, I feel like your living situation is really remarkable in its proximity to other permaculture-minded people, and also Aprovecho Sustainability Research Institute. And maybe could you talk a little bit maybe about the community that you're in and a little bit of the history as well?
Sure, yeah. So Cundick is kind of an interesting community in a lot of ways. It's in rural Oregon, so we're about half an hour south of Eugene, which is kind of the big city nearby. And over the past several decades, there's been kind of a number of different communities that have sprung up in the area and kind of laid their roots down and spread out and kind of grown over time. And Aprovecho, which is a nonprofit educational center, was one of them that was established in 1981. And I've been involved there since 2006, and I'm currently on the board of directors. I lived there for about 5 years, and kind of towards the end of my tenure of being on site there, we found that there was this property for sale on the same road, and decided to kind of make the move into land ownership. And we were really privileged in that regard. This is an area that has, it's quite a bit cheaper. The land is cheaper around here than in many other parts of Oregon near to bigger cities. So it has some of the kind of socioeconomic challenges associated with more rural areas in America, but it's been interesting to kind of be working on that, kind of changing that dynamic a little bit. And also because of those land prices and just, the availability of relatively, intact ecosystems where people can access things like fresh water and, not be in super close proximity to heavy duty industry or industrial agriculture. There's a lot of small farms and neat kind of people that have made their homes here as well. And so we've had a chance to kind of connect in with them. And there's a lot of really neat kind of mutual aid type situations that have arisen in this community even before the pandemic arose. So we had kind of this more kind of a durable network to spring into or fall back on as things kind of intensified. And it's been interesting to watch that evolve relatively quickly into all these different projects and activities. And I know right now people are really reeling with the most recent iteration of kind of the implosion of our current social political context, but I really feel like those kinds of connections amongst community members are really the kinds of things that are going to see us through and hopefully building into something more just and regenerative for more people, because that's, what I think our attention is really being called to right now.
Thank you. I know that I've felt very blessed to have had a community that we've cultivated here in Salt Lake Valley. The Utah Permaculture Collective has a Facebook group that it's been remarkable. We've been getting like 30 to 50 new members a week ever since this has been going on. And whenever someone is posting about a new project or has a question about growing food or chickens or whatever it might be, there's like, often dozens of comments of people helping and problem solving. And I guess having you on here, I definitely want to tap into your expertise. I mean, you spent quite some time writing a very beautiful and well-reputed book on this topic. You still see it, right? Where people are saying, here's a picture of a plant, and is this a friend or is this a foe? And there's kind of this narrative that is pretty dominant, that there are weeds, there are invasive species, and that we have to do battle against these species in order to properly interact with our landscapes. And I imagine, Tao, that you might have some things to say about that kind of mindset. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I kind of came into the field of ecological restoration from a permaculture background and just kind of thinking about a more holistic approach to land management. So I was really, and I knew about invasive species before I got this job doing restoration, but I didn't really realize that the whole kind of paradigm of ecosystem restoration was so focused on invasive species as these kind of bad actors. And it was really surprising to me that so many people that were so invested in ecological conservation and enhancement were so invested also in the apparent necessity to use herbicide and pretty much any means possible to get rid of these plants and animals in some cases. And it really kind of was a wake-up call for me, that I think in the same way that, organic agriculture is a response to the conventional framework where you think of things as pests and you spray them, and you don't really look at the bigger picture of what's going on in the ecosystem that might be leading to plants being stressed and having herbivorous insects eat them. It's similar with invasive species. It might not be as immediately obvious, and it might be kind of a longer term approach that you have to take to kind of change the dynamics in a landscape where invasive species thrive, but the same principles hold no matter where you look. And that's kind of, one of the things that permaculture has really taught me, is that there are these kind of overarching ecological patterns that if you start to see things from that perspective, it just applies everywhere. And, invasive species are no exception. I really think that once you can kind of understand the fundamental patterns of what's leading an ecosystem to kind of look a particular way and have particular plant and animal assemblages at a given time, you can start to see how you can work with those threads to make it into something, an assemblage that you'd rather have there. And so you kind of can just remove that whole concept of invasive or, weedy, and think about the regeneration potential. And that's kind of where I come from with it. Invasive species to me are just a symptom of centuries, essentially, of land degradation. And, it's kind of similar to what we're seeing today with the protests and the massive militarized police response to them. What we're seeing is the embodiment of centuries of oppression and brutality against largely communities of color, and repressing that with a warlike mentality is not addressing the root of the issue. And if we really want to address the root of the issues that are coming to light today, we're going to need to do some really hard work as individuals, communities, as a nation, that's based on this fiction of, stolen land in the first place. We're going to have to recognize those things and call them out and call them in. So yeah, I see a lot of parallels with what's happening today and just the mindset. And I think that, as people interested in regeneration and community development, like really taking these principles to heart and applying them wherever we can is really what we should be looking towards. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, I feel like I should be taking notes right now because it's such good information. It's like so many good nuggets of wisdom to draw from, just the commentary on invasive species actually, fitting into our ecosystems. How do we make room for them rather than creating a warlike mentality around them? There is this concept of invasive war, like consuming weeds and getting to know weeds, and especially in wild nature, instead of going for native plants or mushrooms that are more rare, eating things that are invasive or taking over is kind of a more advanced way of seeing what foods we need to eat. Yesterday for lunch, in the morning I was weeding. I was like pulling plants out of my garden that I didn't want in my garden, but it was a wild amaranth, and when the plants are small, just a few inches, they can be cooked, sautéed, and or put in a soup, and they're really high nutrient, really high in vitamins. And I really like the concept of eating the thing that you don't want in your garden, or stewarding it with your body in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much richness to that because, on the one hand, as you mentioned, a lot of native species are, threatened population-wise because of the development practices and agriculture, forestry, deforestation, the kinds of things that we do in our current economy. And I've actually heard the call from several Indigenous folks more recently about, as foraging becomes more popular, that, non-Indigenous folks actually focus on invasive species as as their forage materials of choice, and leave the native species for Indigenous folks to use in their traditional context. And I think that that's a really important thing to consider. Also, just as you mentioned, Rikki, there's so many invasives that are edible and highly nutrient dense, and their populations are in many cases very viable. And one of the things that I like to think about is kind of using that process of stewardship through use and cultivation in a way to, if you're wanting to move the ecosystem in a different direction and not have invasive species so prevalent in a particular area, you can harvest them and make use of them as you work to regenerate it to something else that you would rather have there. So you kind of change your mindset from just kind of getting rid of them to really thinking about how you can incorporate them into a plan for moving into a more regenerative space. So
what would you say on more of a broad scale? Because on the micro scale or the human scale, and maybe that's part of the solution, right? That's kind of staring at all of us, is this more human scaled interaction with our agriculture and our landscape restoration. But there's also, vast tracts of land that often, when you're coming from this kind of dominating collegiate perspective, there's this like huge desire to run around in RVs and just spray everything that you don't like. And I wonder, for those that are listening to this that might be kind of aware of like more of the broad scale invasive species battling that's going on in larger broadacre situations. What kinds of things did you develop, and how would you talk about maybe some of the large acreage sort of problems that might be needing to be turned into solutions here?
Well, one of the first places that I start with any kind of landscape analysis is looking at the historic Indigenous management of an ecosystem, and what kinds of patterns people kind of put in place in the landscape where they lived. And what, for the most part, Indigenous people were displaced from those management strategies. And that has had significant effects on landscapes. And so that's kind of like the foundational approach, is kind of acknowledging the extent and scale of management and really doing the research about what that looked like in any given place. Was it fire? Was it management of buffalo? Was it, more like what we think of as agriculture, like corn, bean, squash? What was the pattern in place for the last 10,000+ years in North America pre-contact? In Oregon, in the area where I live, Indigenous burning was made illegal in 1859, which is 1 year after Oregon achieved statehood, quote unquote. So the displacement of that management strategy, which kind of created the oak savanna ecosystem where I live, happened about 170 years ago. I mean, there was a process in place, but the formal prohibition of that management strategy was that long ago, and we can see the results of that lack of fire in our landscape everywhere. And invasive species is kind of one of those results. Other things have happened since then, like damming of rivers, trapping the beavers, deforesting the ridges. So we kind of have to, what I endeavor to do is look at all of these different changes, bigger scale changes that have happened, and then start to develop kind of an eye for how they've created the conditions in which a particular invasive species is thriving. Because we really have to, in permaculture, we kind of talk about starting at the top of the watershed if you can, like really thinking about the biggest picture pattern, right? David Holmgren talks about designing from patterns to details. So you're really looking at these big picture things and then zooming down into the details, which is the invasive species in this case. And so I kind of try to take all of that into account as much as possible. And then from there, kind of like work back up and say, well, we're not necessarily going to be able to reintroduce fire into the landscape everywhere. We're not necessarily going to be able to reintroduce buffalo, everywhere, even though I think that would be great.
Bring back the
we
buffalo.
We have to kind of build it into a realistic picture of the current context. So then, there's always that kind of classic permaculture saying, the answer to every question is, it depends. It really depends. It depends on what scale we're talking about, what kinds of land and water dynamics are going on. I might recommend, see if you can get a beaver and release it into your stream and see what happens. Because that will probably alleviate many of your concerns around invasive riparian vegetation. Let's restore the floodplain.
Can you just go
if
get
you can work,
a beaver?
The higher up the system you can work.
How do you encourage beavers back?
It
just occurred to me, you don't just go shopping at the beaver store. But sorry,
they're on Amazon for $29.99.
To your door by
sourced. Are they shade grown beavers?
You can, in certain places, get on lists where people are live trapping them and wanting a place to put them.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I feel like in public waterways they don't like beavers because they're like, we spent $50 on that cottonwood tree and
right?
it's getting chewed down. But
yeah,
I love beavers.
You have to plant more.
Yeah.
I love how Joel Salatin talks about how there used to be such a huge population of beavers, and like the skeletons that they dig up, some of them were the size of VW bugs, and at a few hundred years ago, instead of just 1% of North America being water, it was all the way up to 8%. So 8 times the amount of water, rivers, lakes on North America, which, I mean, just to imagine that kind of wealth, especially here in Utah and in the desert regions that we're accustomed to. You're a little more blessed with water up in the Oregon area, but for those that are watching, you know, one of the special things about our podcast is we're now incorporating this live streaming technology, and I want to remind anybody who's watching that they can leave comments or questions, and we'll save a portion at the end here to address those and see if there's any that Tao can discuss with us. But something I also felt really called to talk about is, like, as we're sitting here recording live, there are enormous amounts of uprising going on and curfews, and so much is happening, and it feels like this is so momentous and so urgent and so right now. And permaculture, and as we talk about coming back into relationship with our land and our communities and growing food together and really, you know, planting the trees that will someday sit in the shade of, what keeps your optimism in check, Tao, and maybe talk a little bit about your vision for this more beautiful world and this beautiful potential that we're all a part of, even juxtaposed at a time of such great unrest.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about that so much lately, and you know, I feel like now more than ever, like, I've always kind of felt like something like this was going to happen. Like, you know, just knowing that the systems that we live within are so fragile and so predicated upon so much violence and, you know, negating of history, and at some point it is going to kind of explode, and it has, and it needs to. And you know, I was hoping, I think in somewhat of a naive way, that we would be a little bit better equipped to be of service and kind of ready to kind of roll out, or just have more people have better access to land and food systems that were a little more robust. But we've gotten so, things have gotten so kind of bound up in the corporate reality of livelihood for so many people. And I think that as permaculture folks, we really need to be thinking about how we can intervene or find those like leverage points to really affect change for the largest number of people, because, you know, I don't think things are going to get easier. And, you know, ever since, for me becoming a parent, I've kind of been like, oh, well, I just wish, I've always thought that there was going to be this kind of revolution of sorts, but I was just kind of hoping that maybe we could kind of just ease into this more like green economy and have a Green New Deal, and maybe we could just kind of address some of these systemic issues in that format. I'm still hopeful that might happen at some point, but at this point, I think that's really up in the end. You know, just looking at the news of like half an hour ago, it seems like things are clamping down even more. And I know people all over the country are really grappling with what that is going to mean. And I think that all of us, our creativity and our passion are really, and our desire to be helpful and engaged is really going to be put to the test. And so, yeah, I guess I am kind of still optimistic, but I do, in a realistic sense, I think that it's going to continue to escalate and intensify. So.
Yeah, when you were talking earlier about controlled burns, I couldn't help, I have those imagery in my mind right now of burning police cars and police stations, and this force that's been just oppressing and creating these rigid rules around what is wild and natural and part of humanity and diversity. It's I feel like this is a moment of burning and some deconstruction, at least on these sub-layers or communities that have been unable to express or live their fullest lives for a long time. And so it's my hope to be part of this movement and supporting whatever structures have to burn right now in order to, so those ponderosa pines and morels can sprout, and all the things that thrive off of a freshly burned, clean palette, so to speak, can emerge. And I think about these kind of iterations of social movements from the Occupy Wall Street movement when I was taking my PDC in 2011, and then Standing Rock. There's so many kind of evolutions of how we resist. And now we're kind of at this point where it's the biggest movement, collective movement that I've ever seen I think that's ever happened collectively.
At least in my memory. I'm feeling really called to share something if I could. I woke up, I think it was yesterday, and someone had texted me how do we, with all your work in trying to support local food movements and community, how do we try to get these protests in line with some of those ideas? And for me, for one, these protests, they're going to burn however they're going to burn. And there are so many different perspectives going on right now and different truths that are needed from all of these different fractal energies. And so I'm not just saying oh, great, why don't you all just grab a shovel and let's do that tomorrow, right? It doesn't resonate like that for me. But there was kind of almost like a poem that I want to share as we're on this topic of the new growth that comes after fire. And I hope that's okay to share this. In the wake of fire, in the ashes of failed promises, in the releasing of all that does not serve us, new growth stirs and honors its earthly pact to explode from beneath our feet and flourish in the gentle caress of what might yet still be our destiny. I can hear the birds chirping. I can see them making their homes in the fruit trees of tomorrow, nestled in gardens planted and cared for in common unity by peacemakers, community builders, and earth warriors. We can build and protect communal centers dedicated to mutual aid, gardening, cooking, and healing, all within thriving distance of every home. A place of reconnection and refuge, a place to plan and mobilize and meet our needs in radical and ancient ways. Here, we will honor and give thanks to the cycles of fire, for without them we would be left to forever navigate a gnarled and neglected landscape, a forest shaped from an empty colonial promise which is transformed into nightmare and betrayal. The forest we leave to burn has been suffering for far too long, cut off from compassion and right relationship. This forlorn and fading landscape, filled with injustice and inequality, serves as a mirror for our disconnection and of our failure to each other and the eternal promise of our finite sacred planet. Let us seize the golden purpose of our righteous anger and honor the opportunity of new life that it spurs, taking a moment to listen to the begging and the cheering which is coming from the future, coming from our children's children's children, that we may choose to live and love for today and to offer up our humble stewardship to the gardens of tomorrow. Yeah, I hope that was all right to share as we're on the topic of fire and new growth. I don't know, did that stir anything worthy of discussion?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that that's such a beautiful vision, and I think that so many people are, coming from, just seems like, 2 weeks ago, I was like, okay, this pandemic, what has that shifted in us? Like the need to stay home and really be present in the home space, and, localizing your livelihood to a great degree, and realizing that, the frontline workers are at this point so necessary and valuable to people's lives. And really, I think it's really kind of changed people's focus onto things like supply chains and distribution networks, and our level of reliance on external forces. And, it was kind of a time of pause, I think, for everybody in the whole world, which is also unprecedented. And now, we have an added layer of just rising up against centuries of injustice. And, this brings up this whole other related series of concerns and ideas and ways of moving forward that really kind of get to the root of that. And there's just so much that's really at play right now. And especially in the United States, I think that and I think I think we have some creative work that's going to need to be done very quickly to be able to live into the vision that you expressed there so beautifully. So yeah, that's how I'm feeling today. Like, we really need to be thinking forward through what's likely coming down the pike here.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier something about people that are working in the permaculture zone, or just have that vision of a more beautiful world, a more ecological world, a more just world. You said it's really important for us to be paying attention to leverage points right now, and I think that's worth digging into. When, like you said, like some of this stuff has really caught us off guard. Like there isn't a robust, decentralized, diverse, thriving support system for the 7 billion people on this planet right now. And given that there is so much at stake and so much opportunity, where do you see some of the leverage points where people that, have the privilege to lead in these capacities and give some solutions? Like maybe let's dig into that a little more.
Yeah, well, I think local food and resource systems are, as always, incredibly important, and even more so. I know that at least in my community, there's been a lot of work just kind of identifying available spaces for gardening, like several landowners who don't farm but just have places have contacted me about wanting to make their land available for food production, so that we can start kind of really ramping up if and when the need arises. Like if supply chains are disrupted to the point where there's not food on the shelves of the stores anymore. And as we're seeing, I was reading that one farm, a big kind of conventional farm, producing produce, every single worker of a 250 employees tested positive for COVID-19 recently. And, we're kind of seeing these hotspots emerge in, these incredibly already economically disadvantaged communities working in places like meat packing plants and on farms and places where it's really difficult to maintain, the social distancing and things like that. And, I think that, to me, my mind is turning at once to trying to serve people who are more vulnerable than I am, and really like thinking about how I can leverage my own privilege. Like that is a leverage point for me right now, and like really trying to, as much as I can, be of service, because it would be really easy for me to like just hunker down here. I've got the water catchment system, I've got the gray water, I've got the composting. Like I spent a really long time setting all this up. I have all the fruit trees, but I don't want to hunker down right now. That's not like my goal in life, because I just, it's just so increasingly clear that people are suffering and they don't have the privilege that I have to have bought land, and so identifying public spaces for food production, and really, like I've been talking with the school district, like there's all of these different kind of threads of conversations around food production, and that's kind of more my specialty, I guess, like something that I've spent a lot of time doing. But I think we're really going to need to be thinking about creating more durable local economies in general, and what that looks like in terms of, training opportunities for people to re-engage in different types of jobs, quote unquote, or, fulfilling life, meaningful activities that really focus on restoration and regeneration, and really contributing locally is something that I'm passionate about as well. I feel like that's kind of, for me right now, like a longer term picture of thinking about how to develop or be part of developing kind of retraining concepts for people, especially where I am. We're kind of in the tail end of like industrial forestry, having kind of wreaked its havoc on the land and the economy here. And so really thinking about how we can retool that in a creative way for, future regenerative potential is something that I think is really exciting. Oh, here comes my little one.
The wily
sounds pretty sad.
We've probably got time for one more question, and then we'll be shifting to any potential comments or questions that have come up through the live stream. In fact, we might even just have one right now. So, yeah, we're gonna go ahead and read it. One question I have is, how do you think we can reach people who aren't already interested in permaculture and regenerative economies with these messages about invasive species and also social change? Not to be laughing, there's just kind of an interesting studio effect of reading the question while looking around a camera for any that were wondering about that. So did you hear that question okay?
You want me to repeat it?
Oh. Maybe I can.
Do you mind if I just take a pause to grab my little guy and bring him in?
Absolutely.
Sorry. Thank you.
Maybe both of your comments, the last two comments that you had, remind me of when I saw Angela Davis present a couple of years ago at USU. She talked a lot about how poetry, music, arts that come out of these revolutionary moments in history are really influential. And when we start feeling the change and the transition from unsustainable or toxic modalities into living, growing, creative, artful ways, then that that powers the movement in ways that you can't just academically pick apart or say like, oh, we're making progress. It's like creating that emotion and identifying it and living it and breathing it is really what powers the emotion of the movement. And then when Tao was talking about with, sharing food and having localized food systems also reminds me of something she said about the Black Panther movement, a large part of that being Black communities reclaiming their food systems and the relationship of having to farm and grow on the land versus actually growing food for themselves and diversified gardens for their own communities is empowering in a way that nothing else is. And there's a lot that was written into the Black Panther kind of manifestos that was about food sovereignty. And it just felt like relevant to share those little learning moments with Angela.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important to highlight as well. And, kind of to your question, Michael, about how to encourage folks to move in this direction, I kind of feel like it's happening already. And to some extent, like just, I think, designing our systems to be as open and welcoming as possible, and also kind of responsive to the unique needs of your particular social economic context, also really valuing the importance of like decolonization work and implicit bias and systemic racism training. Like, we really need to be, I think, super engaged in those ongoing and difficult conversations as individuals and organizations, and really making sure that the spaces are as welcoming in a real deep way and community-led as possible. I think there's so much work to be done around really rethinking like hierarchical structures and how we can relate in a more consensus-based way. And it's just really this kind of rich space for engaging with each other when we're kind of used to engaging as consumers, quote unquote, or as like kind of regents of the state and being told what we can and can't do and when and where. And we really need to kind of step into the spaces where we're investigating that for ourselves and creating locally based solutions to some of the issues that are just inevitable that are going to come up, and being ready for that. And it's a big task, or a series of huge tasks that lie in front of us, and we're the ones we've been waiting for. I do feel that, as daunting as it may seem.
It can be daunting.
At times.
I really appreciate all the wisdom that you brought to the table today, Tao, and for spending this time with us. And I'm grateful that you were an original permaculture teacher for Rikki, and that this kind of like conversation about weeds could lead to this like whole colonial dominant power structure that just isn't working anymore. And I think really beautiful topics today, and I appreciate you so much for being on our Permanent Culture podcast and live stream. We did post in our event and in the description about where people can purchase your book. Is there anything else about, maybe PDCs that you might be offering, or any other things going on right now? How can people stay connected to your story as you're helping get humanity a little more on track, a little more inspired?
Well, I do work with an online permaculture course through Oregon State University, and that's really design focused. Get to kind of design a site that you're working with, and so it's kind of a unique opportunity to go through that. And that I also just by following my website, resiliencepermaculture.com, I kind of keep the different events and things that I'm involved in updated on there. And yeah, that's kind of a constantly evolving space as we have different projects going on, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, but also open to, especially if and when things change with the pandemic, traveling around, because we've done quite a bit of that as well, just kind of helping people wherever help is needed. So
beautiful. Well, I'm grateful for the permaculture discussions. It's hard for us because we used to have a weekly potluck every Monday night with our community, and a great chance to remind each other that no, we're not crazy. There is deep truth and wisdom for this reconnection and for this path. And I just you're really reaffirming a lot of my own feelings about what's needed in the world today, and making me feel a little less crazy and a little more excited about the path that we've devoted ourselves to. Is there anything else alive in us that needs to come up as we're wrapping up here? Rikki, any final thoughts for the evening?
I'm just grateful that you were able to join us today amidst all of this upheaval. Feels like a kind of breath of fresh air in a time when so many of us can't breathe. And just a moment of solace together feels important.
Yeah, it feels good just to know that, there in Salt Lake City, you've got this, and the greater Utah area, you've got this collective going, and, you guys are doing good work. And I look forward to visiting sometime. I love it out there. It's beautiful. I've lived in New Mexico in my past life, so I love that area of the world. Special spot.
Yeah,
Definitely.
well, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Tao. And I'm sure you've got it sounds like a beautiful, perhaps a little bit upset child in the background somewhere that could use your love. So we'll go ahead and let you go, and let our folks that are live streaming with us today go. And just a reminder, this podcast episode will be up wherever podcasts are to be found within about a week or so. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Tao, and we'll see you guys next time we do this.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tao.